All right, well, I'm sitting here with Stacey Robinson, and I'd like to thank you for talking to us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
To start with, I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about your work.
Okay. Um, my work is always in a state of flux, and always thinking about different subject matters. However, my work is always dealing with reconciling Black past, acknowledging the Black present, and I'm speculating and thinking about the Black future. Right. So the current series I'm working on right now is a series called Fear of a Black God. Right, and it looks at.
Great title.
Oh, thank you. Well, and in that, even in that title, I'm shouting out the Black past, Fear of a Black Planet, right? 1991 album of Public Enemy, right? But I'm also thinking about this in reference to my religious past, connected with various religions. I'm not going to name them, just various religions, but and finding my way, or these are. This is my foundation, my moral foundation, my ethical foundation, and in a sense, my regimen, right? How I conduct myself, my work ethic, those type of things. But, so in that, I'm also thinking about the Black past, the unhealed, very traumatic, unreconciled past, right? Trying to navigate that in the present, right? But still speculating, thinking about the future. So my work in this particular series of thinking about Fear of a Black God, I'm looking at several things. One of which is, what do Black utopias look like? So in my examination of Rosewood, Florida, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and several other segregated Black communities, we didn't create segregation. It was something that was forced on us, but we dealt with that. Right, and in dealing with that, we flourished. Right, the argument that I make is not very politically correct, but it's very true historically. We were better as a people segregated than we are integrated. Right? And I would challenge anybody to counter that. Right. So, saying all that to say, in thinking about Fear of a Black God in this sub-series, what do Black utopias look like? I'm thinking about, and I'm making work that examines things like, what does Prince's erotic city look like? What does Martin Luther King's mountaintop look like? What does Outkast's Stankonia look like? What does Tupac's Thug's Mansion look like? What does Family Stan's Ghetto Heaven look like? And many, many others, right? So the thing about these Black utopias is they could not exist in the Matrix, right? This particular world, right? They had to exist in the mind, right? They had to exist in the mind and then exist in the music, right? So I'm looking at, as a visual artist, what do these utopias look like? Because they're not described in so much detail, right? You feel it. Right? There are words that talk about it, but what do they visually look like?
So what is it exactly about comics as a medium that's been conducive to your work? Like, what is it you feel about comics that enables you to approach these things?
To be honest, I know how comics work, and I know how to use visual language, right? And I think that's my strength. Right. So even in visualizing this, right, I use a comic aesthetic. I also use a graphic design aesthetic. I'm using color theory. I'm even thinking about sacred geometry, right, and building these spaces, even visually thinking about these, right. Comic books is storytelling. It's sequential storytelling. But once you have the science of the storytelling down, once you have the science of comics down, you can break the code and you can do so many other things with it. So the beautiful thing about comics is that they have the unique ability to combine text and image, or just text or just image, right? But they work in a very unique way where you can connect to multiple generations of people, right, through storytelling. And I find that fascinating.
Do you feel that text and image, or at least juxtaposed sequential text and image, is the definition for comics, if there is one, or is it always fluctuating?
No, I think it is always fluctuating. I think it always should. I don't think that they should stay in a particular type of framework when they always work in this particular way. I don't agree with that at all. I think that very unique type of art and text juxtaposition, right? The expanding of that, the challenging of that, right, allows for better examination of the future, right, in doing that. So I think it should always be remixed, reimagined. I do.
Well, if you could speak a little bit about comics with an X and what that means.
Right. So the comics with an S, COMIX, right, is the underground spelling, the resistance to the mainstream spelling of comics, right? COMICS, right? However, the way that it is also used by black creators is many times thought of as an amalgam of two words, code mixing, right? So which is...
is there a conscious distancing there from like maybe the stuff that Crumb does or something like that, do you think?
I think that whenever black creators are making work, whether it's mainstream or underground or independent, it is always a pushback from anything that is not imagined by black creators, right? Because even being a black creator, if you're working in a mainstream industry, for example, that's a revolutionary act in itself.
Right? What is your impression right now of the current industry?
I'm always back and forth with it. I have my issues with it, but the issues that I have with the mainstream comic book industry, the lack of representation, and when I say representation, I don't mean just, oh look, there are new black characters. You know, I could argue that reappropriating old white characters and making them black now is not really diversity. I would make that argument. But I'm talking about real empowering diversity in reference to editorial staff, not just artists and writers, but people who make the decisions, right, on what type of content is actually made, right? And artists and writers do that to some extent, but that's what I'm looking at and thinking about. So in saying all that to say, talking about comics, COMIX, that is a form of pushback as well, fighting to get into these mainstream positions where change could take place from the higher positions, right? However, I'm more interested in what's happening in the independent and underground scene. I think that we have total liberty there. Especially with on-demand publishing, for example, or the ability to publish online and use social networking, right? There's this ability to tell your message without, what was the Comics Code Authority, right? We don't have to do that now, thinking independently, right? And I'm using the Comics Code Authority as an example of the type of policing, right, that typically takes place with current day. Not, even though that there is no Comics Code Authority, I'm talking about just using that as an example. But right now, we can do what we want to do, and I think that's important.
Well, who have been some of your influences in both the mainstream and the underground comics scene?
Ooh, so one of my major influences in comics, he is an artist, his name is Brian Stelfreeze. Now, a lot of people don't know who Brian Stelfreeze is, but a lot of people do. I call Brian Stelfreeze the Yoda of comics. I call him the J Dilla of comics. And what I mean by that is when you, and this was my experience, went to a comic book convention several years ago, and I was just getting back into the scene, and I wanted people to critique my pages, you know, and see where I was at, right? And they were like, "Oh, you want a real critique? You need to go see Brian Stelfreeze." I knew who he was. I heard of him. I mean, everybody was telling me to do this, right? So I went over there, waited in line. He gives the best critiques ever, ever, ever. Very unassuming, wonderful, lighthearted black artist, right? Incredible, incredible guy. Even dresses in color theory. It's really easy. The guy is a genius on every level. He is one of my favorite artists because, and I'm hear what I'm going to say when I'm saying this. He is your favorite artist, right? So if you, and I use this example a lot. So if you like Kanye West, you like his production, right? You need to be looking at Jay Dilla, right? That's why I call him the Jay Dilla of comics. He is a master of every element of comics, and with an amazing, you know, I'm going to say he has a photographic memory. I don't know if that is necessarily the case, but I've seen him flip through an entire comic book, close a book, give it back to the person, and critique it page by page. I've seen him do this, right? I've seen his lines. I've waited in his lines to give a critique, and there's only 5 people in front of me. Oh, but I'm going to be there an hour and a half because of the intensity of his critiques, and everybody's standing, waiting around him like he's Yoda, right? And what he gives you, you go home and apply. So when you see him the next year, he's like, "Oh, I remember your book. Yeah. Oh, you applied what I told you." He talked to hundreds of people, but he remembers what he told you. He's the Yoda of comic books.
Well,
right
now as we sit in front of your work, I'm curious about Kirby, the illusion of Kirby and what Jack the King has meant to you and your work.
Yeah, so I mean, there is no mainstream comics without Kirby. Right. So as much as I talk about building black futures, right, I'm always reaching back to the past, right, always. The Black Kirby work came from the Marvel movie is about to drop. I mean, the Avengers movie is about to drop. You had Hulk, Iron Man, Thor. You had all of these amazing movies coming out, right? They came out already. Avengers movie is about to drop. Jack Kirby is not getting credit for his creations. As critical as we are of mainstream comics, we realize that this is, I don't want to choose my words, this is messed up, right? We decide, what are we going to do about this, to think about this, have this conversation. So we use Black Kirby as a way of talking about his aesthetics, right? Talking about his contributions while celebrating him in this, but also critiquing the comic book industry and their lack of diversity while we're celebrating Jack Kirby as well. We're saying, yo, hey, this is the mainstream industry. This is this very monolithic, these very monolithic white ideas, but there are some overlaps here with black mythologies and sciences and ways of thinking, right? So when we make a character called the Unkillable Buck, right, and you look at Darren Wilson's testimony about Michael Brown, and you compare that to the Incredible Hulk, right, there are these overlaps that are very easy to understand, and they create a type of conversation, right? So saying all to say, we're John Jennings and I, we do this in celebration and critique of the mainstream comic book industry, but while still thinking about giving Jack Kirby the credit that he deserves, that he was not getting from, you know, as these movies are being made. Now he actually gets credit in the lines of the movies. I would love to think that we had something to do with that. Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't matter, but it matters that we said something about it and we did something about it.
Now, technically, as an artist, who have been some of your influences?
John Byrne growing up. I was a major John Byrne fan of his earlier work. Gil Kane, definitely. Still a fan of Gil Kane. Still look at his work. Comic influences. Oh my goodness. Keith Pollard. There was a time when Keith Pollard was drawing Thor, Spider-Man, and I think he may have been doing another book all at the same time, right? I've heard of writers writing 3 books. I haven't heard of artists drawing 2 and 3 books, you know, different books a month. Several. I mean, I could go on forever. Neil Adams. I remember, I'll share this story about Mark Bright. I remember being a 16-year-old, right? I walk into my local comic book store, and I'm so depressed. I am so depressed. And I'm walking through, and the comic shop owner, he's like, Stacey, what's wrong? I'm not used to seeing you like this. I'm like, oh man, JC, I tell you. JC at Earthworld Comics in Albany, New York. And I'm a 16-year-old, and I'm like, you know, I want to draw comics, but there are no black comic artists. And he was like, what are you talking about? Do you know who Mark Bright is? I was like, yeah, Mark Bright is like my favorite artist right now. He's drawing Iron Man. He's a black artist. I was like, what? Immediately, my world changed. Immediately. Because there was somebody who looked, I'd never seen him, right? But my world changed. I'd still never seen him. He could have been lying to me. He wasn't, but he could have been. But my world changed because I imagined inside the comic book industry, there was somebody who looked like me. And that person's artwork was amazing. He was my favorite artist, right? So he was a favorite. I went on to work in the comic book industry, you know, interning, right? Then found out, said, oh no, this is really not for me, not at all, not at all. But those are some of my influences. That's a long answer, but some of my influences.
Well, going from those influences, how have you seen your own work evolve over time?
Yeah, so I started out, of course, you start out duplicating your favorites. I still do that, actually. I do it intentionally now. So I have more than comic influences. Charles White is a fine artist who's a major influence of my work. Ernie Barnes, and I came into Charles White through Ernie Barnes, right? Ernie Barnes was a major influence. For those who don't know who Ernie Barnes is, he's the Good Times artist. If you know the show Good Times, you know JJ's work, that was actually Ernie Barnes, right? I actually thought JJ did the work when I was younger, right? But so even the fine art influences come into my work. Charles Bibbs is another one. So I purposely, in my work, I shout out my influences by duplicating their style. So if you look at the Black Herbie work, I purposely try to use some of John Jennings' techniques in the creation of my work too, because I'm always shouting out my inspirations. It's not that I don't have my own style. I have various styles I'm really good at, but it's important for me to shout out the people that have inspired me.
And in regards to the symposium, what were some of the things that you were anticipating coming here, and what are some of the things that have touched you in some way? What are some of the things that, I know it's so much, everything was fantastic, but you know, these
pick out a few, right? It's like, okay, oh my goodness. In comparison, so last year was the second Astro Blackness. That was my first year though. And I was like, this was amazing. Oh my God, this was amazing. So much networking took place. So many things happened from last year to this year that changed my career, that really helped to put my career, push it toward the, you know, with that trajectory that I wanted, right? This year, I really have to process, right? There was so much information that came. Nobody presented, nobody was whack. Nobody was corny. Everybody was on their A game. There was so much information that I absorbed. So some of the things that really stood out to me was the very last panel, for example, where we talked about archiving, right? This component to the Afrofuturist movement. Archiving, documenting. You know, my grandchildren can look at this and say, oh, that's granddad. You know, look, that's granddad right there, right? And that's important, right? So that, and making a conscious effort to do that, right? That stood out to me. Talking about the Black Speculative Arts Manifesto, right? And what that means, and Afrofuturism 2.0. Looking at maybe the flaws of 1.0, right? Or what did not take place that should have taken place in 1.0, and working to achieve those things in 2.0, right? Thinking about, okay, so what is 3.0 going to be looking like, right? And keeping an open manifesto where it can always be changed and edited. Those type of things really stood out to me. I met people that I'm actually working with for the first time, or people that have, that I will be working with, or that I've heard about that have inspired me. Cherie Renee Thomas, for example, her book on Dark Matters, right, a collection of short stories, Afrofuturist stories, was my introduction to a lot of Black speculative fiction. And that book changed my life. And I just met her right here, but I'm under contract to work on a graphic novel with her, right? But I'm just meeting her for the first time. So I'm saying all that to say that so many of the key people in Afrofuturism were right here, and I'm coming in like as a fan, but I'm also a colleague.
If there's been a common denominator with all of these interviews, it has been this building of a sense of community.
Absolutely.
And I think in your field, being that it's a collaborative field,
yes,
that's got to be one of the best things about this.
Yes, and it's planned, it's designed, it's supposed to function that way. The Afrofuture is not built by one person, right? That would be a dictatorship, and that would be very scary, right? I would not want to. I say that a lot, in my own work. I'm thinking about the Afrofuture, and I'm talking about how do we build and brand the Afrofuture, but I cannot do it in my own thinking. I have to look outside of my very finite thinking, right? Or it's flawed, right? So saying all that to say that experience here, and you feel that, you see that, right? I mean, you have diversity here, right? You have sexual diversity and ethnic diversity and gender diversity and whatever, educational diversity, the way that we look at topics, for example, right? But we're all thinking about how do we build a free future?
Well, speaking about the future, and this might be a very difficult question now that we're on the cusp of
here we
ending
go.
this one, what do you foresee for next Astro Blackness?
Oh,
what
really
would you
gonna
like
ask
to
that?
see? Right as this one ended.
Right. Oh my goodness. What I see for next year is I see the manifestation of many of the things that we're talking about. The projects, the meetings that have been taking place, over drinks, right? I see the manifestation of those particular products, right? Those books, those journals that are really important in talking about archiving the Afrofuture. I see those things taking place, at least starting, right? I see more networking. I see a lot more people at the next Astro Blackness. I have no idea where that's going to be next year, right? But I see more people present. I speculate there will be younger people as well. Not to say that the people here are too old. I totally disagree with that, right? But I also see a younger audience coming. One of the things I was talking to John about is that there needs to be a comics component connected to this, right? We need words and pictures that help people see the speculation of the future, right? And it would fit so well with this, right? So I see that next year. Don't quote me on that. I'm not saying it will take place, but that's definitely something I mentioned. Yeah.
Right. And for one last fun question.
Okay.
In the vein of Bernard Pivot, his question there, what superpower would you like to have and why?
Oh my goodness. Whew. As much as I struggle with my weight, oh my goodness, an awesome controlled metabolism at my will would be awesome. I probably would say probably flight. I've always been fascinated with, and I dream about my ability to fly. And I actually do believe that people can fly. I think it's a matter of what we don't tap inside of our minds. I do believe that we can astral project, right, and teleport. I actually do believe that. I think it's a matter of the lack of a connection in our mind, right? So I'm interested in it sounds very, very simple. You probably will hear that 100 times today, but flight, definitely. I want to fly. Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much for this interview, and thank you so much for everything. It's
Thank you
been
for
a
having
really
me. I
great
appreciate
experience.
it. Thanks. All right. Great job. Thanks.